At 76, Margaret Calloway stood in a courthouse parking lot with everything she owned inside a fading sedan and a check for $4,200 that was supposed to represent a lifetime of marriage. By sunset, she would have no house, no job, and no one left who was obligated to care whether she slept inside or not. 3 days later, she would spend almost all of that money on an abandoned schoolhouse no one wanted, unaware that beneath its crumbling hearth lay something that would force her to choose between survival and a legacy that was never meant to be hers. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. 3 days earlier, she still believed the worst part was over. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of paper and stale coffee, the kind that had been sitting too long on a warming plate. Margaret sat upright in a chair that was too soft for her back, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as if posture alone could keep her from slipping apart. Across the desk, the attorney spoke in a careful, practiced tone. Words like equitable distribution and premarital assets drifted through the air, each one landing with the quiet weight of something final. Margaret nodded when it seemed appropriate. She had always been good at nodding. The house, it turned out, had never really been hers. It had belonged to Richard before the marriage, an inheritance from his family. The retirement accounts were separate. His was larger, hers was modest. The settlement was, on paper, fair on paper. Margaret kept her expression still as the lawyer slid a document toward her. She signed where she was told, her handwriting steady, almost elegant. After all these years, she refused to let her hand shake in front of anyone. Richard wasn't there. He hadn't been for weeks. His absence felt less like a wound and more like confirmation. 34 years of shared life reduced to signatures exchanged in separate rooms. When the meeting ended, the lawyer stood and offered a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sorry it came to this, Mrs. Calloway." Margaret nodded again. "So am I." But she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. Outside, the afternoon light felt too bright. She walked to her car slowly, as if the pavement might shift under her feet if she moved too quickly. The sedan was older than she cared to admit, its paint dulled by years of sun. Inside, the passenger seat held a cardboard box filled with books. The trunk held the rest, what little there was. She sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. $4,200. She said it in her mind, once then again, as if repetition might make it larger. $4,200 for a lifetime. She thought about the kitchen she had kept spotless for decades, the dinners cooked, the quiet support she had given every time Richard needed to be somewhere else, another conference, another lecture, another life that seemed to expand while hers stayed carefully contained. She had told herself it was temporary, that her turn would come, that next year would be different. Next year had never come. A car passed behind her, tires crunching softly on gravel. Margaret blinked and realized she'd been staring at nothing. There was no house to go back to, no job waiting, no one expecting her. For a brief, disorienting moment, she felt as if she had been erased, not all at once, but slowly, over years, until only the outline remained. Her hand tightened on the steering wheel. No, not erased, just finished. The thought settled heavier than she expected. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was the check. She looked at it for a long time, tracing the numbers with her eyes as if they might rearrange themselves into something more forgiving. They didn't. She folded it carefully and put it back. Then, without quite deciding to, she thought of a place she hadn't considered in years, Hollow Creek. The name came quietly, like something remembered in a dream, a road winding through the Blue Ridge Mountains. A small cabin that had belonged to her mother, passed down from a grandmother whose voice she could almost still hear if she tried hard enough. She hadn't been back in decades. Life had been too full of other obligations, other priorities, other people, but the cabin had never been sold. The property taxes had been paid, year after year, almost automatically. A habit she had never broken, even when everything else shifted around her. Margaret exhaled slowly. It wasn't much, she knew that. The place would be old, possibly falling apart. It might not even be livable, but it was something, and right now something was more than she had. She turned the key in the ignition, the engine hesitated, then caught with a low familiar rumble. The sound grounded her in a way nothing else had all day. She adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of herself. The lines in her face looked deeper in this light. Her eyes, though, were steady. Not broken, not yet. She pulled out of the parking lot without looking back. The road stretched ahead, long and uncertain, disappearing into a horizon she could not read. For the first time in years, there was no plan waiting for her at the end of it. Only distance, only time. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of everything she had just lost, a forgotten place in the mountains that might still remember her. Margaret tightened her grip on the wheel and pressed the gas a little harder. She didn't know what she would find in Hollow Creek. She only knew she had nowhere else to go. And as the city faded behind her, replaced by open highway and the slow rise of distant hills, a quiet, unsettling thought began to take shape, one she couldn't yet explain. What if that place had been waiting for her all along? The highway narrowed the farther she drove, the lanes pulling closer together, as if the road itself were unsure how many people still needed it. Margaret kept both hands on the wheel, her shoulders stiff from hours of driving, her eyes fixed ahead. The city had fallen away behind her long ago. Now there were only stretches of forest, old gas stations with faded signs, and towns that seemed to exist more in memory than in motion. She stopped once, just after sunset, at a small roadside diner that smelled like grease and coffee. The kind of place where no one asked questions unless you stayed too long. She ordered the cheapest thing on the menu and counted her cash twice before handing it over. $4,200. Now slightly less. She ate slowly, not because she was hungry, but because she didn't know when she would next allow herself to spend money without calculating what it cost her future. That thought sat heavier than the food. By the time she stepped back outside, the air had turned colder. The sky stretched wide and dark above her, stars scattered across it in a way she hadn't seen in years. For a moment she stood there beside her car, breathing it in. The quiet pressed in from all sides, unfamiliar but not entirely unwelcome. Then she got back in and kept driving. By mid-morning the next day, the land began to rise. The blue-ridged mountains didn't announce themselves all at once. They unfolded gradually, the road bending and climbing, the air thinning just enough to feel different. Trees crowded closer, their branches reaching over the asphalt, casting shifting shadows that flickered across the windshield. Margaret rolled her window down an inch. The air smelled like damp earth and leaves, something older than the city, something she hadn't realized she missed. Hollow Creek. She hadn't said the name out loud yet, as if speaking it might change it, or worse, reveal that it no longer existed the way she remembered. Places like that didn't always survive time. They faded quietly until only the people who left remembered they had ever been real. The sign appeared around a bend, weathered wood, paint peeling, the letters still just legible enough to read. Hollow Creek Pop, 342. Margaret slowed without meaning to. Her chest tightened, not with fear but with something harder to name. Recognition maybe, or the faint echo of a life she had set aside and never returned to. The town itself looked almost untouched. One main street, a handful of buildings, a general store with a sagging porch, a church sitting slightly elevated on a hill, white paint dulled by years of sun and rain. There were changes, a new sign here, a boarded window there. But the pace, the stillness remained. Nothing rushed in Hollow Creek. It simply continued. Margaret drove through slowly, aware of eyes on her car. Not hostile, just curious. Outsiders were easy to spot here, even ones who had once belonged. She didn't stop. The road out of town narrowed again, turning into a stretch of gravel that crunched under her tires. Trees closed in tighter. The sky disappeared behind them. She followed the path from memory, though it had been decades since she last drove it. At one point, she thought she had taken a wrong turn. Then she saw it. The cabin stood farther back than she remembered, partially hidden by overgrown brush. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, patched in places with mismatched shingles. The porch leaned just enough to make her hesitate before stepping onto it. Margaret turned off the engine and sat for a moment. This was it. Not much. Not impressive, not even entirely safe, but it was hers. She opened the door and stepped out. The gravel shifted beneath her shoes. The silence here felt different from the highway, deeper, thicker, as if it had been collecting for years. The front door stuck when she tried to open it. She had to lean her weight into it before it gave with a soft groan. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood. Furniture sat under white sheets, shapes softened by time. Margaret walked in slowly, her footsteps echoing faintly. She pulled one of the sheets back. A wooden table, another, an old rocking chair. She recognized it instantly, though she couldn't remember the last time she had seen it. Something in her chest loosened just a little. This place hadn't been waiting for her. It had simply endured. She moved through the rooms, taking inventory without quite realizing she was doing it. The roof would need work. The windows needed sealing. The place was livable, barely if she was careful. Careful, that word again. Margaret stepped back outside and looked at the tree line. Beyond it, the land sloped upward into thicker woods. Somewhere past that, if she remembered correctly, there had been an old trail, one she used to walk without thinking. She hesitated, then started toward it. The path was harder to find than she expected. Time had nearly erased it, the ground uneven, roots pushing through the soil. But as she walked, something shifted inside her. Not memory exactly, more like instinct guiding her feet. She climbed slowly, her breath steady, her body reminding her she was no longer the woman she had once been. But she didn't stop. The trees thinned as she reached a small clearing, and there it was. The schoolhouse stood alone at the edge of the ridge, smaller than she remembered. Its wooden siding faded to a gray that blended with the landscape. The roof was rusted tin. Several windows were broken, jagged edges catching the light. It looked like something forgotten on purpose. Margaret stepped closer. There was a sign above the door, barely readable. She brushed her hand across it, clearing away dirt and moss. Penrose Hollows, Schoolhouse, established 1908. She stood there longer than she intended, the wind moving through the trees behind her. Something about the place felt familiar, not in the way of memory, but in the way of recognition. As if she had arrived somewhere she had been meant to find, even if she couldn't explain why. The door hung slightly open. That surprised her. She hadn't expected anyone to come up here, not recently at least. The hinge creaked as the wind nudged it. Margaret stepped onto the threshold and looked inside. Dust covered everything. Rows of old desks, some tilted, some collapsed. A blackboard at the front, faint chalk marks barely visible. The air felt colder inside, as if the building held onto time differently than the world outside. She took one step in, then another. The floor groaned under her weight, but held. Margaret moved slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through broken windows. She reached out and ran her fingers along the edge of a desk, feeling the grooves carved into the wood. Names, old ones, left behind. She didn't know why her gaze drifted toward the center of the room, toward the stone hearth. It looked out of place in a one-room schoolhouse, larger than it needed to be. The stones uneven, some darker than others. The kind of thing built to last, not to look pretty. Margaret stepped closer. Something about it pulled her in, quiet but insistent. She crouched slightly, brushing dust away from the edge of one stone. It felt solid, older than the rest of the building maybe, or just made. She straightened slowly, her eyes still on it. For a strange moment she had the feeling that she was standing in front of something that mattered. Not in a practical way, in a way she didn't yet understand. The wind outside picked up, pushing the door open a little wider behind her. It creaked loudly in the silence. Margaret turned her head, suddenly aware of how alone she was. Then she looked back at the hearth, and this time she noticed something she hadn't seen before. One of the stones didn't quite sit flush with the others. Margaret didn't move right away. She stood there, staring at the uneven stone, her breath slowing as something quiet and deliberate settled inside her. The kind of feeling that came not from fear, but from certainty. Not about what she was seeing, but about what it might mean. She crouched again, closer this time, and ran her fingers along the edge of the stone. The others were packed tightly, their seams filled with hardened mortar. This one wasn't. There was a narrow gap along one side, thin but real. Someone had placed it there, not perfectly. Intentionally. Margaret leaned back slightly, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting someone to appear and explain it. The silence held, no explanation came. Only the soft sound of wind slipping through broken glass. She pushed herself upright and stepped away from the hearth. Her heart had picked up, not wildly, but enough that she noticed. It had been a long time since anything had made her feel curious, not worried, not resigned, curious. She walked back toward the doorway and stood there, looking out over the clearing. The mountains stretched beyond, layered in muted blues and greens. The world outside felt wide and indifferent. Inside, something waited. Margaret glanced back at the hearth again, Then she made a decision. Not to open it. Not yet. Instead, she turned and left the schoolhouse. The door creaked behind her as she stepped back into the daylight. The shift in temperature hit her skin immediately, warmer outside, brighter, more certain. She stood there for a moment, letting the air steady her thoughts. Whatever that stone was hiding, if it was hiding anything at all, it wasn't going anywhere, and she wasn't ready to face something she didn't understand in a place that barely held together. Not alone, she walked back down the trail more slowly than before, her mind working in quiet loops. The image of the hearth stayed with her, pulling her attention back to it no matter how she tried to focus on the ground beneath her feet. An uneven stone, a gap where there shouldn't be one, a feeling that something had been left behind. By the time she reached the cabin, the sun had shifted higher in the sky. The light cut through the trees at a different angle, making everything look sharper, more defined. Margaret paused at the porch, one hand resting on the railing. She could feel the tiredness in her legs now, the weight of the climb settling into her joints. Age had a way of reminding her of itself at the most inconvenient moments. But beneath the fatigue, something else lingered. Purpose. It had been a long time since she felt that too. She went inside and pulled one of the sheets completely off the table, folding it carefully and setting it aside. The act was simple, but it grounded her. Small task, one visible change, something she could control. Margaret moved through the cabin with a quiet focus, opening windows, letting air move through the rooms, brushing dust from surfaces that hadn't been touched in years. Each movement pushed back against the feeling of displacement that had followed her from the city. This place might be worn, but it wasn't empty. By late afternoon, she sat at the table with a glass of water and the envelope still in her purse. She took it out again, unfolded the check and stared at the number, 4,200. Now less after the drive, less after the meal, less with every decision she made. Her eyes drifted toward the window, to the line of trees beyond which the schoolhouse stood. She could ignore it, pretend she hadn't noticed anything unusual. Focus on making the cabin livable, stretch her money as far as it would go, find a way to exist quietly until time decided the rest. That would be the practical choice. The safe one. Margaret folded the check again and set it on the table. Then she shook her head, almost to herself. Safe had never been hers. Not really. She stood up, slower this time, her body reminding her again of its limits, and crossed to the small storage closet near the back of the cabin. The door stuck slightly when she opened it, the wood swollen from years of damp air. Inside, there were a few tools, old but usable, a hammer, a small pry bar, a rusted bucket. Margaret picked up the pry bar and turned it over in her hands. It felt heavier than she expected, solid in a way that reassured her. Something built to last. She held it there for a moment, then let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. This wasn't about money. Not yet. This was about knowing. She stepped back outside, the pry bar still in her hand, and looked toward the trail again. The light had started to soften, shadows stretching longer across the ground. Evening was coming, she hesitated. If she went back now, she would be working in fading light, alone in a building that might not be entirely safe. The rational part of her mind listed the risks one by one. Old wood, unstable floors, no one nearby if something went wrong. Margaret listened to all of it. Then she started walking anyway. The climb felt steeper the second time. Her legs protested, her breath coming a little shorter, but she didn't stop. Each step carried a quiet determination that surprised even her. She wasn't just returning to the schoolhouse. She was choosing something. When she reached the clearing, the building stood exactly as she had left it, silent and waiting. The open door shifted slightly in the breeze, a low creak echoing across the empty space. Margaret stepped inside. The light had changed, the interior was dimmer now, the shadows deeper, stretching across the floor in long, uneven shapes. The air felt cooler, still. She walked straight to the hearth, no hesitation this time. She set the pry bar down beside her, then knelt carefully, her joints stiff as she lowered herself. Up close, the uneven stone looked even more deliberate. The gap along the edge was just wide enough to slide the tip of the tool into. Margaret positioned the pry bar and pressed down gently. Nothing. She adjusted her angle, applying a little more pressure. The stone shifted, just slightly. Her breath caught. She paused, listening. The building held steady, no cracking, no warning signs, only the faint scrape of stone against stone. Margaret pressed again, harder this time. The edge lifted a fraction of an inch. Enough to prove she hadn't imagined it. Her pulse quickened now, not from exertion, but from something sharp, anticipation, fear. A strange electric mix of both. She slid her fingers into the gap and pulled. The stone came loose with a low, grinding sound, heavier than she expected. She set it aside carefully, her hands steady despite the tremor she felt in her chest. Beneath it, darkness, a small recess in the foundation. Margaret leaned closer, squinting into it, trying to make out what lay inside. At first, she saw nothing. Then, slowly, shapes began to form in the dim light. Edges, corners, something stacked, wrapped, hidden. Her hand hovered over the opening, and for the first time since she stepped into the schoolhouse, Margaret hesitated, not because she didn't want to know, but because she suddenly understood that whatever she was about to uncover might not belong to her at all. Margaret's hand hovered over the opening for a long moment, suspended between instinct and restraint. The darkness beneath the hearth seemed deeper now that she had uncovered it, as if it were holding something that had waited a very long time to be seen. She reached in. Her fingers brushed against fabric first, rough, dry, not recently placed. Whatever was hidden there had been left undisturbed for years, decades maybe. The thought sent a quiet chill through her. She pulled slowly, careful not to tear anything. A bundle came free in her hands, wrapped in what looked like old canvas, its edges stiff and frayed. Dust lifted into the air as she set it gently on the floor beside her. The smell that rose from it was faint but unmistakable, aged paper, dry wood, time. Margaret sat back on her heels, staring at it. This wasn't money, not gold, not anything she could recognize at a glance as valuable in the way the world measured value, and yet someone had hidden it. Carefully, deliberately. She reached for the canvas and unfolded one corner. Inside were books. Not printed ones, hand-bound, leather covers worn but intact, each one marked with a year in faded ink. The top one read 1938. Margaret exhaled slowly, her chest tightening with something she didn't fully understand. She picked it up, the weight surprising her. It felt substantial. Real. She opened it. The handwriting inside was neat, steady, unmistakably practiced, a teacher's hand, the kind that wrote on blackboards and corrected papers with quiet precision. March 3rd, 1938. Margaret leaned closer, her eyes scanning the page. Mr. Holloway came again today, asking if I would consider closing early for the season. Said the roads are too dangerous and the funding uncertain. I told him I would keep the school open as long as even one of them chooses to come. Margaret blinked. She turned the page. April 10th, 1938. Miss Carter arrived without shoes again. I gave her mine and walked home. It is only 3 miles. I do not think she will mention it. She is proud in that quiet way. Margaret's hand tightened slightly on the edge of the journal. This wasn't just a record. It was a life. She flipped forward, her movements slower now, more deliberate. June 2nd, 1938. The board has reduced our supply budget again. I have begun purchasing paper and pencils myself. It is not ideal, but it is necessary. Margaret closed the journal halfway, her eyes lingering on the last line. It is not ideal, but it is necessary. Something about that sentence struck her harder than it should have. She had said things like that before, not in those exact words, but in meaning, in choices, in quiet decisions that no one else noticed. Margaret swallowed and set the journal down beside her. Her gaze drifted back to the bundle. There were more of them. Dozens, maybe. She reached back into the recess and pulled out another stack, this one tied with a thin piece of twine. The motion was easier now, her hesitation replaced by a growing need to understand what she had found. The second bundle wasn't journals. It was folders, old yellowed envelopes, each labeled with a name. Margaret untied the twine carefully, her fingers slower now, almost respectful. She opened the first one. Inside were letters, all addressed to the same person, Miss Cordelia Wren Ashby. Margaret felt something shift inside her. Cordelia. The name settled into place, no longer abstract, no longer just a guess. It belonged to the voice she had just read. She unfolded the first letter. The paper was thin, creased from age, but the ink remained clear. Dear Miss Ashby, I don't know if you'll remember me, but you once stayed after hours to help me prepare for my certification exam. I passed. I'm working now, steady work, and I wanted you to know that none of it would have been possible without you. Margaret's breath caught. She picked up another letter. Miss Ashby, I still have the book you lent me. You told me to return it when I was done, but I never did. I needed it more than I realized at the time. I hope you understand. Another, Dear Miss Ashby, I have enclosed a small check. It isn't much, but I have not forgotten what you did for me when I had nothing. I hope this helps someone else. Margaret stopped. Her hands went still. A check. She looked back at the envelope. The check was still there, tucked inside, never deposited. Her mind tried to catch up. She opened another envelope, then another, more letters, more gratitude, more attempts to give something back, and again checks, small ones, larger ones, all uncashed. Margaret sat back slowly, the papers spread around her now, the air thick with the quiet weight of what she was seeing. This wasn't hidden because it had no value, it was hidden because someone had chosen not to use it. That realization hit differently, not like a discovery, like a question. Why? Margaret's gaze drifted toward the journal again, then back to the letters. A pattern was forming, though she couldn't yet see all of it. A woman who gave, people who tried to return it, and a decision repeated over and over not to take it back. Margaret felt her chest tighten. She knew something about that kind of choice. She had lived it. Not in the same way, not as intentionally maybe, but she had given things away without counting. Time, effort, pieces of herself she never expected to be returned, and she had never once thought of it as a legacy, just what needed to be done. Margaret reached for the journal again, flipping further ahead. November 14th, 1941. Thomas says I should think about the future more carefully, that I cannot spend everything on others. I told him the future is exactly why I do. Margaret froze. Thomas. The name lingered on the page, carrying weight she couldn't yet place. She turned the page. The handwriting changed slightly, still steady but tighter, more contained. December 10th, 1941. He has been called. I will not write of it in detail. There is nothing to say that will make it less final. Margaret felt the shift immediately, the tone, the silence between the lines. She kept reading. January 2nd, 1942. The school remains open. That is enough for now. Margaret closed the journal gently, her fingers resting on the cover. The room felt different. Not just old, occupied, not by people, but by everything they had left behind. She looked around slowly, her eyes moving from desk to desk, from the blackboard to the hearth. This place wasn't forgotten. It had been preserved, quietly, deliberately. Margaret's gaze dropped back to the recess. There was still more inside. She leaned forward again, reaching deeper this time. Her fingers brushed against something harder. Wood, a box. Smaller than the others, but solid. She pulled it out carefully, setting it beside the journals and letters. It was sealed, not locked, but closed in a way that suggested intention, finality. Margaret stared at it, her pulse steady but louder now in her ears. This felt different, more personal, more guarded. She placed her hand on the lid, paused, then lifted it. Inside, at the very top, lay a photograph, black and white. Two adults standing in front of the schoolhouse, a woman and a man. The woman held herself with quiet confidence, her expression calm but resolute. The man stood beside her, slightly turned toward her as if the camera had caught him mid-glance. Margaret leaned closer. The woman had to be Cordelia, there was no doubt in that now. But the man, something about him felt familiar, not clearly, not enough to name, but enough to make her breath catch. Margaret picked up the photograph, her fingers trembling just slightly now. She turned it over. There was writing on the back, faded but legible, and as she read the name written there, something inside her shifted, sharp, immediate, undeniable. Because it was a name she recognized. Margaret read the name again and again. The letters didn't change. They didn't rearrange themselves into something more distant, more abstract, something she could dismiss as coincidence. They stayed exactly where they were, ink pressed into paper decades ago. Beauregard. Her throat tightened. It wasn't a common name, not here. Not in the life she had lived, not in the quiet corners of memory she rarely allowed herself to revisit. She lowered herself slowly onto the floor, the photograph still in her hand. The room seemed to tilt slightly, not physically, but in the way meaning shifts, when something you thought was separate suddenly connects. Thomas Beauregard. The name echoed against something deeper. Margaret turned the photograph back over, studying the man's face again. He looked young, but not in a way that placed him in a different world. There was something steady about him, something familiar in the way he stood, slightly angled toward Cordelia, as if she were the center of gravity. Margaret swallowed. Her mother had mentioned that name once, just once, years ago, in a conversation that hadn't seemed important at the time, a story told casually. about a man who never came back from the war, about a woman who never married. Margaret had never asked more. Back then she had assumed it was just another piece of distant family folklore. Something old, something already resolved by time. But now, she looked around the schoolhouse again, at the desks, the blackboard, the hearth she had just opened. This wasn't folklore, this was real. Margaret reached back into the wooden box, her movements slower now, more careful. Beneath the photograph lay a small bundle tied with a faded ribbon. She untied it gently, revealing a stack of letters. Different from the others, these weren't addressed to Cordelia. They were written to her. Margaret unfolded the first one. The handwriting was different, more angular, more restrained. Cordelia, they say we may ship out sooner than expected. I will not pretend I am not afraid, but I find myself thinking less of what may happen to me and more of what will remain behind. You must promise me something. No matter what comes, you will keep going. Margaret exhaled slowly. She flipped to another. If I return, we will build something here. Not just a home, but a place that matters. If I do not, then you must build it anyway. Her chest tightened. Build it anyway. The words hung there, suspended between past and present. Margaret's gaze drifted back to the room around her. This place, this schoolhouse. Had it been that thing? Had Cordelia done exactly what he asked? Margaret pressed her lips together, her thoughts racing ahead of her understanding. The letters continued, each one carrying a quiet urgency, a future that had once felt certain and then stopped. The last letter in the bundle was shorter, dated just days before everything must have changed. Whatever happens, know this, what we choose to give matters more than what we keep. That is the only way anything lasts. Margaret lowered the letter into her lap. For a moment, she didn't move. The silence pressed in again, heavier now, filled with something that felt almost like expectation. She looked back into the box. There was one more item, a small envelope sealed but not tightly. Her name was not on it. No name was, just a single word written in the same careful hand she had seen in the journals. Accounts. Margaret frowned slightly and opened it. Inside was a folded ledger sheet. Not a full book like the journals, just a summary, columns of numbers written with precise consistency, dates, amounts, names. She scanned the first few lines, her brow tightening. Payments not received. Given small amounts at first, then larger ones always tied to a name. Always marked with a brief note. Books, travel, medical, tuition. Margaret's breath slowed as she moved down the page. The total sat at the bottom, a number that made her blink. She read it again, then a third time. It wasn't a fortune in the way the world talked about fortunes. But it was enough to matter, enough to have changed lives, and every line told the same story. Cordelia had given it away. Margaret sat very still, the ledger resting in her hands. This wasn't just kindness, it was a system, a pattern. Something sustained over years, maybe decades. She thought of the letters again, the ones she had read earlier, the checks that had never been cashed, money that had come back, money that had not been kept. Margaret's mind tried to assemble the pieces. Cordelia gave, others tried to return it. Cordelia refused, so what happened to that returned money? Margaret's eyes moved back to the recess in the floor, to the journals, to the letters, to the box. Was this it? Had Cordelia hidden it away? Not spent it, not claimed it, just preserved it for what? Margaret felt a shift inside her, something deeper than curiosity now, something that bordered on responsibility. This wasn't hers, she knew that, but she was the one who had found it, which meant she was now part of whatever came next. The thought settled heavily. Margaret gathered the items carefully, placing the letters back in their bundle, setting the photograph aside but within reach. She closed the wooden box gently, her hands lingering on the lid. She wasn't done, not even close. She looked at the journals again. 46 years if the labels were to be believed. 46 years of choices, of giving, of building something that no one had documented except the woman who lived it. Margaret reached for one of the later volumes and opened it. The handwriting had changed slightly, older but still steady. May 1974. The school will close at the end of the month. They say there is no longer a need for it. I do not argue. The world changes, but I wonder what becomes of a place when the purpose it was built for is declared unnecessary. Margaret's throat tightened. She read on. I have done what I could. The rest will belong to someone else, though I do not know who. Perhaps that is as it should be. Margaret closed the journal slowly. Someone else. The words lingered. She looked around the room again, this time not as a stranger, but as someone who had stepped into something unfinished. Her chest rose and fell with a deeper breath. If this place had been waiting, it hadn't been waiting for just anyone. That thought unsettled her more than anything she had found so far. Margaret gathered the photograph and turned it over once more, her eyes tracing the name again. Beauregard. Her mind moved quickly now, connecting threads she hadn't known existed. Her mother, a story half told, a name she had never questioned, and now this. Margaret stood slowly, her joints protesting as she pushed herself up. She held the photograph in one hand, the journal in the other. The light in the room had dimmed further. Evening was settling in, shadows deepening across the floor. She needed answers. Not guesses, not memories that might or might not be accurate, real answers. Margaret turned toward the door, her decision already forming. Tomorrow she would go back into town. She would find someone who knew this place. Someone who understood its history not as a story, but as fact. Because if that name meant what she thought it might, then this wasn't just a discovery. It was personal. She stepped outside into the cooling air, the photograph still in her hand. The mountains stretched out in front of her, quiet and unchanged. But something had shifted, not out there, inside. Margaret looked down at the back of the photograph one more time, and for the first time since she had read the name, a new question surfaced, one she hadn't been ready to ask before. If Cordelia had built all of this, and if Thomas Beauregard had been part of that beginning, then why had her own family never spoken of it again? And more importantly, who had decided to keep it buried? Margaret didn't sleep much that night. She lay in the narrow bed in the cabin, staring at the ceiling where the wood grain twisted into shapes that meant nothing and everything at once. The photograph rested on the table beside her, along with the journal she had taken from the schoolhouse. She had told herself she would wait until morning to think clearly. But clarity didn't come, only questions. The name Beauregard kept returning, circling back through her memory like something unfinished. Her mother's voice, soft, distant, mentioning it once over coffee years ago. A story that had seemed irrelevant then. A man lost, a woman who never moved on. Margaret turned onto her side, her joints stiff, her breath slow. Why hadn't anyone told her more? Why had something this significant been reduced to a passing comment? She closed her eyes, but the image of the photograph remained. Cordelia and Thomas standing together in front of the schoolhouse. The same building she had walked into that afternoon, as if stepping into a continuation she had never been invited to understand. By morning, she had made up her mind. She wasn't going to sit with guesses. She needed someone who knew the history of this place, not as a story passed down loosely, but as something recorded, remembered, anchored in fact. Margaret dressed slowly, the chill of the cabin lingering in the air. She tucked the photograph into her coat pocket and carried the journal under her arm. She hesitated before leaving, glancing back at the room. The box, the letters, the rest of the journals, they stayed hidden for now. Not out of fear, but out of instinct. This wasn't something to bring out into the open too quickly, not until she understood what she was holding. The drive into town felt shorter this time. Familiarity had already begun to take hold, the curves in the road less uncertain, the trees less imposing. When she reached the main street, it looked the same as the day before, quiet and steady. Margaret parked near the general store. The bell above the door rang when she stepped inside, a sharp, clean sound that cut through the stillness. The smell of wood polish and old paper greeted her, mixed faintly with coffee. Mr. Gormley stood behind the counter, exactly where she expected him to be. He looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly before recognition settled in. "Well," he said, his voice even, "you're the one who drove in yesterday." Margaret nodded once, stepping closer. "I need to ask you something." He leaned one arm on the counter, studying her for a moment before responding. "Depends what it is." Margaret reached into her coat and pulled out the photograph. She placed it carefully on the counter between them. "Do you recognize this?" Mr. Gormley didn't touch it at first. He leaned forward, adjusting his glasses slightly as he looked down. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then his expression changed, subtly. "But enough. Where'd you find that?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "In the schoolhouse," Margaret said. That was enough. He let out a slow breath and picked up the photograph, holding it with a kind of careful familiarity. "That's Miss Ashby," he said, tapping lightly on the image of Cordelia. "No doubt about that." His finger shifted. "And that's Thomas Beauregard." Margaret felt her chest tighten. So it's real, she said, more to herself than to him. Mr. Gormley looked up at her then, his gaze sharper. You didn't think it was? I didn't know what to think, she replied. He nodded slowly, setting the photograph back down. Most folks around here don't talk about him much, not anymore. Been a long time. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but quieter now. Why? Mr. Gormley hesitated, not because he didn't know, because he was deciding how much to say. Because it didn't end clean, he said finally. And people around here, they don't always hold on to things that don't have a neat ending. Margaret absorbed that. What happened to him? She asked. He went to war, Gormley said. Didn't come back. That's the short version. And the long version? Gormley's mouth tightened slightly. The long version's harder to prove. Some say he died overseas. Others say there wasn't enough left to bring home. And some, he paused, some think there's more to it than that. Margaret's pulse picked up. More how? Gormley shrugged, but it felt deliberate. There were letters. Official ones. Then there were gaps. Things that didn't line up. Folks talked for a while, then they stopped. Why would they stop? Because nothing came of it, he said simply. No answers, just questions that didn't go anywhere. Margaret glanced down at the photograph again. But Cordelia stayed, she said. Gormley nodded. She stayed, taught there for decades, never married, never left. Margaret hesitated, then asked the question that had been building since the night before. Did she have any family? Gormley shook his head. Not that anyone knew of. She kept to herself, mostly. Had the school. That was her life. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the counter, and no one ever wondered what she left behind. Gormley gave a small, almost humorless smile. Oh, they wondered. But there wasn't much to find. No will that anyone saw. No property except the schoolhouse, and that went back to the county when it closed. Margaret felt a quiet shift in her understanding. No one looked harder, she pressed. Gormley studied her again. Why would they? He said. She didn't live like someone who had anything worth leaving. Folks figured whatever mattered, she gave it away already. Margaret swallowed. That part, at least, was true, but not the whole truth. She reached for the photograph, sliding it back toward herself. What about the Beauregard name? She asked. Are there still people here connected to it? Gormley's expression changed again, more cautious this time. There used to be, he said. Family-owned land not too far from here. Most of it's been sold off over the years. Most of it? He hesitated, then nodded toward the window, toward the road leading out of town. There's one parcel left, he said. Up past the ridge. Not many folks go out that way anymore. Margaret felt the weight of that settle. Who owns it? Gormley didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her now, as if seeing something he hadn't before. Then he said quietly, You might want to ask yourself that before you go looking. Margaret frowned slightly. I don't understand. Gormley leaned back, crossing his arms. You said you found that in the schoolhouse, he said, and now you're asking about the Beauregards like it matters to you personally. He paused. Maybe it does. Margaret held his gaze, her heartbeat steady but loud in her ears. What are you saying? Gormley didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached under the counter and pulled out an old ledger book, different from the one she had found, but similar in age. He flipped through it slowly, then turned it around so she could see. Land records, he said. Old ones, not official copies, but enough to follow. Margaret stepped closer. Her eyes scanned the page. Beauregard. The name appeared again. Next to it, another name, Calloway. Her breath caught. The two names sat side by side, written in the same entry, connected not by rumor, not by memory, by record. Margaret looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. How is that possible? Gormley met her gaze. That, he said, is the part no one ever explained. Margaret stared at the ledger page, her eyes fixed on the two names written side by side. Beauregard, Calloway. The ink had faded slightly over them, but the connection was unmistakable. Not a coincidence, not a guess. Something recorded, intentional, preserved in a way that suggested it had mattered, once. She felt her pulse in her throat. That doesn't make sense, she said quietly. Mr. Gormley didn't respond right away. He watched her instead, the way someone watches a person reach a conclusion they're not ready for yet. It makes sense, he said finally, just not in the way you're expecting. Margaret lifted her gaze. Then explain it to me. Gormley shook his head slowly. I can't explain what I don't fully know, he said. But I can tell you this, those names didn't end up next to each other by accident. Land records don't work that way. Margaret looked back down at the page. The entry wasn't long, just a transfer notation. A parcel boundary adjustment, something that would have looked ordinary to anyone not paying attention. But she was paying attention now. Who filed this? She asked. Gormley leaned forward slightly, adjusting the ledger so she could see the smaller print beneath the names. County clerk at the time, he said. Early 70s, from the look of it. That's when most of the land around here started changing hands. Margaret traced the date with her finger. The same year the schoolhouse closed. The same year the last journal entry had been written. The same year Cordelia had stopped. Her chest tightened. That's not a coincidence either, she said. Gormley didn't argue. No, he said quietly. It's not. Margaret straightened slowly, her mind moving faster now, assembling pieces that didn't yet form a complete picture but were beginning to press against each other with increasing force. Cordelia had no known family. The land had transferred anyway, and somehow the name Calloway had entered that record at the exact moment everything else ended. Her name, her family. Margaret closed the ledger gently, pushing it back toward Gormley. I need to see the official record, she said. Gormley nodded once. County office in Marshall, he said. About 20 minutes out. They'll have the full filings if they haven't been boxed away. Margaret picked up the photograph again, sliding it carefully back into her coat. And the Beauregard land you mentioned, she said. The one that's still owned. Who holds it now? Gormley hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough. Someone local, she pressed. Local enough, he said. Why won't you just say it? Gormley exhaled slowly, then met her eyes. Because a man who owns that land isn't the kind of person who appreciates strangers asking questions about old property lines. Margaret felt a flicker of irritation, sharp and immediate. I'm not asking as a stranger, she said. Not anymore. Gormley studied her again, weighing something. Then he gave a small nod. Bradford Whitlock, he said. Whitlock Mountain Resorts. He's been buying up parcels around here for years. Most folks don't fight him. Easier that way. Margaret felt the name settle. Not familiar, but significant. And he owns the Beauregard land? Part of it, Gormley said. The last piece that never got folded into everything else. Been holding on to it for something bigger, from what I hear. Margaret's grip tightened slightly on the edge of the counter. How did he get it? Gormley gave a short, humorless breath. The same way anyone gets land like that. Patience, timing, and knowing when people are too tired to hold on to something. Margaret absorbed that. Too tired to hold on to something. She knew what that felt like, too well. She stepped back from the counter, her mind already shifting toward the next step. Thank you, she said. Gormley nodded, but his expression didn't soften. Be careful, he added. Whatever you think you've found, it's been left alone for a long time. There's usually a reason for that. Margaret didn't answer. She turned and walked out into the daylight, the bell above the door ringing sharply behind her. The air felt different now, not quieter, tighter, as if something had shifted beneath the surface of the place itself. She got into her car and sat there for a moment, her hands resting on the steering wheel. Marshall, County Records, Whitlock. The pieces were starting to form a direction, but they were also starting to form resistance. Margaret started the engine. The drive out of Hollow Creek felt less like leaving and more like stepping into something she hadn't intended to confront. The road curved through the mountains, the trees closes in again, but this time she barely noticed the scenery. Her thoughts stayed fixed on the date, on the names, on the transfer that had tied Cordelia's world to her own family without explanation. By the time she reached the county office, the sun had climbed higher, burning away the morning haze. The building itself was functional, the kind of place designed for paperwork, not answers. Margaret parked and stepped inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, a few desks, a counter, shelves filled with files that looked like they hadn't been moved in years. A woman stood behind the counter, reading something on a clipboard. She looked up as Margaret approached. Can I help you? Margaret nodded, setting the journal on the counter, not opening it, just placing it there, as if anchoring herself to something real. I need access to land records, she said. Early 70s, Hollow Creek area. The woman glanced at her, then at the journal. Name? Margaret hesitated, then said it clearly, Calloway. The woman's expression didn't change, but something in her posture did. A small shift, almost imperceptible. She turned and walked toward the back room without another word. Margaret waited. The silence stretched, long enough to feel deliberate. When the woman returned, she carried a thin file folder, not the large archive Margaret had expected. She placed it on the counter but didn't open it. "These are restricted copies," she said. "You'll need to review them here." Margaret frowned slightly. "Restricted? Older documents sometimes get flagged," the woman said. "Incomplete filings. Disputes, things that never fully resolved." Margaret's pulse picked up. Disputes between who? The woman didn't answer directly. "Take a look," she said. Margaret opened the folder. Inside were copies of land transfer documents, typed and signed, official seals stamped into the corners. She scanned quickly at first, then slowed as the names began to repeat. Beauregard, Calloway, Ashby. Her breath caught. Ashby, Cordelia. The connection was no longer implied, it was documented. Margaret leaned closer, reading more carefully now. The transfer wasn't clean. It wasn't a simple sale, it was contested. There were notes in the margins, handwritten annotations referencing missing signatures, delayed filings, something about unverified beneficiary designation. Margaret's fingers tightened on the edge of the paper. Beneficiary. Her eyes moved down the page, and then stopped. Because there, in a line that had been partially crossed out and rewritten, was a name. Not Beauregard, not Ashby, Calloway, but not hers, a different first name, someone she had never heard before. Margaret felt the room shift around her, the fluorescent hum suddenly louder in her ears. She looked up at the woman behind the counter. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice steady but low. The woman didn't hesitate this time. "I was wondering when you'd ask," she said. Margaret's grip tightened on the file. "What do you mean?" The woman held her gaze for a moment, then said, "That name shouldn't be there." Margaret didn't move right away. Her fingers stayed on the edge of the file, pressing lightly into the paper as if that might steady something inside her. The words echoed in her mind, sharper now, louder than the hum of the lights overhead. "That name shouldn't be there." She looked up slowly. "What do you mean it shouldn't be there?" she asked. The woman behind the counter didn't soften her tone. "I mean exactly what I said," she replied. "That entry doesn't match the rest of the record trail." Margaret's pulse picked up again, not from confusion this time, but from something closer to recognition, the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something intentional. "Then why is it there?" she pressed. The woman hesitated, just slightly. "Because someone put it there," she said. Margaret let out a slow breath. "That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I can give without speculation," the woman replied. "Officially, that entry shows a transfer connection between Ashby Beauregard and, but there's no supporting documentation attached to it." Margaret's eyes dropped back to the page. "No will? None on file? No probate? Not that matches this entry." Margaret felt a tightening in her chest. "So it just appeared?" The woman gave a small shake of her head. "Nothing just appears in a county record," she said. "It either gets filed or it gets altered. And if it gets altered," she let the sentence hang. Margaret finished it in her head. Someone made it happen. She turned the page, scanning the margins more carefully this time. The handwritten notes stood out more now, no longer background noise but signals. Delayed verification, signature discrepancy, pending clarification, no follow-up. Margaret's jaw tightened. "This wasn't finished," she said quietly. "No," the woman agreed. "It wasn't." Margaret looked up again. Who was responsible for verifying it? The woman reached over and tapped a line near the bottom of the page. "Clerk at the time," she said. "Signed off on the initial filing. After that, it should gone through a secondary review." "But it didn't." "No, why not?" The woman met her eyes. "That's the part no one documented." Silence stretched between them. Margaret felt it settle, heavy and uncomfortable. This wasn't just an incomplete record. It was something interrupted, something left unresolved on purpose, or abandoned when it became inconvenient. She closed the folder slowly. "I need copies," she said. The woman nodded. "I can make them for you," she said, "but I'll have to log the request." "Do it." As the woman turned to the copier, Margaret stepped back from the counter, her thoughts moving quickly now. This wasn't just about Cordelia anymore, or even Thomas. This was about her family. Her name didn't just appear in a record like this without reason. Not in a place like Hollow Creek, where every piece of land had a story attached to it, whether people talked about it or not. Someone had connected her family to this, and then left it unfinished. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around the photograph in her coat pocket. Why? The sound of the copier filled the room for a few moments. When the woman returned, she handed over a thin stack of papers. "Keep these safe," she said. "If there was something wrong with the original filing, it might not stay accessible forever." Margaret took the copies. "What do you mean?" The woman hesitated again. Records get reorganized, she said. Archived. Moved. Sometimes things that don't make sense get cleaned up. Margaret understood exactly what that meant. Removed. She nodded once. Thank you. The woman didn't respond this time. She just watched Margaret as she turned and walked out. The air outside felt sharper, colder. Margaret stood by her car for a moment, the file in her hands, the photograph still pressed against her side. The pieces were no longer abstract. They were documented, real and incomplete. She opened the driver's door, then paused. Whitlock. The name surfaced again, not as a distant possibility, but as something much closer now. He owned the last remaining Beauregard land. He had been acquiring property for years. And this record, this unresolved transfer, sat right in the middle of that history. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. If someone had benefited from an incomplete record like this, it wouldn't be by accident. She got into the car. But she didn't start the engine right away. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out the photograph again. She studied the faces, Cordelia steady and resolute, and Thomas caught mid-glance, as if he had been looking towards something just beyond the frame. Margaret turned it over. The name still stared back at her, Beauregard. Her fingers traced the edge of the paper. You built something, she murmured under her breath, and someone made sure it didn't stay whole. The realization didn't feel dramatic. It felt quiet and precise. Margaret started the engine. She didn't drive back toward Hollow Creek, not immediately. Instead, she followed the road Gormley had mentioned, the one leading past the ridge, where the last parcel of Beauregard land still remained. The road narrowed quickly, turning from asphalt to gravel, then to something less defined. Trees pressed in on both sides, thicker here, older. The kind of land that didn't get cleared unless someone had a reason. Margaret drove slowly, her eyes scanning ahead. After a few minutes she saw it, a gate, metal, recently installed, cutting across the road. A sign hung on it, clean, professional. Private property, Whitlock Mountain Holdings. Margaret pulled the car to a stop. The engine idled softly. She stepped out. The silence here felt different from the schoolhouse, less abandoned, more controlled. She walked closer to the gate, her gaze moving past it, trying to see what lay beyond. The land sloped upward, trees thinning slightly in the distance, and then she noticed it, not a building, not yet, but markers, survey stakes, bright, deliberate, recent. Someone had plans for this land. Margaret's grip tightened around the file in her hand. This wasn't just history, it was about to become something else. She turned slightly, scanning the area, and that's when she saw the vehicle, parked just off the side of the road. White, clean, out of place against the muted tones of the mountains. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out, well-dressed, too precise for this setting. His shoes didn't belong on gravel. His watch caught the light as he adjusted his sleeve. He looked directly at her. No hesitation, no surprise. As if he had expected someone to come, Margaret didn't move. The man walked toward the gate, stopping just short of it. "You're a long way from town," he said calmly. Margaret met his gaze. "So are you." A faint smile touched his lips. Not really," he replied. "This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." Margaret held up the file slightly. "Then maybe you can explain something to me." The man's eyes flicked briefly to the papers in her hand. Something in his expression changed, just for a second. Then it was gone. "I doubt that," he said. Margaret took a step closer to the gate. "The name Beauregard," she said, "and the name Calloway. They appear together in a land record that was never completed." The man didn't answer immediately. He studied her now, carefully, measuring. When he finally spoke, his voice was still calm but tighter. "Records from that time are often messy," he said. "People make mistakes." Margaret shook her head once. This wasn't a mistake. The man's smile faded slightly. "Then what do you think it was?" Margaret met his gaze, steady now. "I think someone didn't want that transfer to be finished." A pause. Longer this time. The wind moved through the trees behind her, carrying a low, steady sound across the ridge. The man's eyes didn't leave hers. "And what would finishing it have changed?" he asked. Margaret felt the answer before she fully understood it. Ownership, control, everything. She tightened her grip on the file. "I think it would have changed who owns this land." The silence that followed was different, heavier, because this time the man didn't deny it. He didn't smile. He didn't correct her. He just stood there. And in that, Margaret realized something far more dangerous than anything she had uncovered so far. He already knew exactly what she was talking about, and he had been waiting to see how much she would figure out on her own. Margaret didn't look away. The man's silence told her more than any denial could have. He wasn't confused, he wasn't dismissive, he was calculating, and that meant she had crossed into something real. "You already knew," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. The man tilted his head slightly, studying her with a new kind of interest. Not casual anymore, not polite, measured. "I know a lot of things about this land," he said. "That's my job." Margaret didn't move closer, but she didn't step back either. The metal gate between them felt less like a barrier now, and more like a line drawn long before either of them arrived. "That record wasn't finished," she said. "Someone stopped it." He gave a faint shrug. "Records get abandoned all the time. Paperwork falls through." "That wasn't paperwork," Margaret replied. "That was ownership." His expression shifted again, just a fraction. "Is that what you think you've found?" he asked. Margaret lifted the copies slightly. "I think I've found something someone didn't want completed." The wind picked up, pushing through the trees and rattling the sign on the gate. The sound lingered between them. The man's gaze dropped briefly to the file again. "Even if that were true," he said, "an incomplete record doesn't give you anything." Margaret held his eyes. "It gives me a question," she said, "and questions don't go away just because they are inconvenient." For the first time, something harder entered his expression. "Inconvenient is one word for it," he said. "Expensive is another." Margaret felt that land where it was meant to land. Money, pressure. The kind language people like him used when they wanted to make something simple again. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she let the silence sit, the same way she had in the courthouse, the same way she had in the schoolhouse when she first found Cordelia's journals, because silence made people fill it, and he did. "You're Margaret Calloway," he said. It wasn't a guess. Margaret's grip tightened around the file. "That's right. I figured you might come up here," he continued, "after the schoolhouse." Her stomach tightened slightly. "You've been watching that place?" "I've been watching everything connected to it," he said. For years, Margaret felt the shift again, deeper this time. This wasn't coincidence, this wasn't just land development. "You knew about Cordelia," she said. "I knew she existed," he replied. "People like her tend to leave impressions." "That's not what I asked." He gave a small, controlled breath. "I knew enough to understand the property had history," he said. "But history doesn't change current ownership." Margaret stepped closer to the gate now, her voice steady, "unless that history was never legally resolved." He didn't answer. That silence was heavier than the last. Margaret pushed further. "Beauregard land," she said, "Cordelia Ashby, and my family name inserted into a record that was never completed. That's not random." The man's jaw tightened. "You're putting together a story," he said. "I'm following a trail," she replied. "A trail that leads nowhere," he said. "Because even if something was left unfinished, it's decades old. Statutes expire, claims disappear." Margaret felt the edge in his voice now. Not anger, not yet, but pressure. "You're sure about that?" she asked. He held her gaze. "I am." Margaret nodded once, slow. "Then you won't mind if I keep looking." That landed. This time, he didn't hide it. "You can look all you want," he said, "but you should understand something before you go any further." Margaret didn't speak. "Land like this doesn't sit untouched by accident," he continued. "People tried to develop it before. Deals fell through, records got messy, ownership stayed unclear." He took a step closer to the gate. "And when ownership stays unclear long enough, someone eventually cleans it up." Margaret felt the meaning settle in. "You mean you?" "I mean someone who knows how to finish what other people leave incomplete," he said. There it was, not a confession, but close enough. Margaret's heart beat harder, not from fear, but from clarity. The shape of it was forming now. Not just the missing record, but the reason it stayed missing. If that record had been completed, she said slowly, "you wouldn't own this land." The man didn't answer. He didn't have to. Margaret took another step forward, stopping just short of the gate. "So someone made sure it wasn't," she said. The wind shifted again, quieter this time, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. The man looked at her differently now, not as a nuisance, not as a stranger, but as a problem. "You're making assumptions," he said. Margaret shook her head. "No," she said, "I'm connecting facts." "And facts can be interpreted," he replied. "Not when they leave gaps like that," she said. "Gaps mean something was removed, or never allowed to exist." He studied her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He smiled again, but it wasn't polite this time. It was careful. "You're persistent," he said. "I'll give you that." Margaret didn't react, and persistence can be admirable, he continued, or it can be expensive. There it was again. Money. Always back to money. Margaret let out a small breath. I've already lost everything worth measuring that way, she said. So that's not much of a threat. Something flickered across his face, not sympathy, recognition. Then it was gone. You bought the schoolhouse, he said. For what, a few thousand? 200, she said. His eyebrow lifted slightly. And now you're digging into records that go back decades, he said. You don't find I find it necessary. He let out a quiet laugh. No, he said. You find it personal. Margaret didn't deny it, because it was. More than she had expected when she first unlocked that door. More than she understood even now. You think this is about you, he continued. About your name showing up where it shouldn't. Margaret held his gaze. I think it's about what was taken, she said. He tilted his head. And you believe you can take it back? Margaret didn't answer right away, because she didn't know yet what it actually was. Land? History? Something Cordelia left behind that hadn't been protected. But she knew one thing, someone had interfered, and he was standing right in front of her. I believe the truth doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient, she said finally. The man's expression hardened, just slightly. You'd be surprised what disappears, he said. Silence stretched again. Longer this time. Margaret felt the weight of it, the reality of where she was standing. This wasn't a conversation she could win in a moment. This wasn't something that would unravel because she asked the right question. This was layered, old, and protected. But it wasn't invisible anymore. She stepped back from the gate. I'm not done looking, she said. I know, he replied. She turned toward her car. And if you find something? He called after her. Margaret paused, her hand on the door. She didn't turn around. Then I'll make sure it doesn't stay unfinished, she said. She got in and closed the door. The engine started, but she didn't drive immediately. Instead, she looked in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, watching. Not worried, not yet, but not dismissing her either. That was enough. Margaret pulled the car into reverse and turned back toward the road. As she drove away, her mind didn't settle, it sharpened. Because now she knew two things: the record wasn't incomplete by accident, and the man who stood to gain from that incompleteness was already aware she was digging into it, which meant time wasn't just a pressure. It was a limit. Margaret's hand moved to the file on the passenger seat. She flipped it open at a red light, scanning the margins again. That's when she saw it. Something she hadn't noticed before. A small notation at the very bottom of the page. Faint, almost erased. Secondary review, assigned to E. Plemons. Margaret's breath caught. Plemons. The name hit her instantly. Eunice Plemons, the attorney. The one person in town who understood old property law better than anyone else. Margaret stared at the note. If Eunice had been assigned to review that record, then she hadn't just been a lawyer in this story, she had been part of it. And for the first time since stepping onto that mountain road, Margaret felt something shift that wasn't fear or anger or even determination. It was something sharper, because now she wasn't just asking what had been hidden. She was asking who had seen it and chosen to stay silent. Margaret closed the file slowly. Then she reached for her phone and hesitated. Because once she made that call, there would be no pretending this was just history anymore. Margaret didn't call Eunice that night. She sat in the car long enough for the engine to cool, the mountain air pressing in through the cracked window, and let the weight of the name settle. Plemons wasn't just a note in the margin anymore. It was a decision point, one someone had reached years ago and walked away from. The next morning, she drove straight into town. Eunice Plemons didn't look surprised to see her. That, more than anything, told Margaret she had been expected. You found it, Eunice said quietly, closing the office door behind her. Margaret set the file on the desk between them. She didn't sit. You were assigned to review it, she said. Eunice nodded once. No denial, no delay, I was. Margaret waited. Then why wasn't it finished? Eunice rested her hands on the desk, fingers laced together. For a moment she looked older than Margaret had ever seen her. Because there wasn't enough to complete it legally, she said. And too much had already been lost. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one, Eunice replied. The Beauregard tract, Cordelia's connection, your family name, it was real. But the supporting chain was broken. Missing filings, unregistered transfers, witnesses gone. By the time it reached me, it couldn't hold in court. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. So it was just left? Eunice shook her head. It was documented, preserved, filed under review instead of finalized. That was the only way to keep it from being erased completely, and you didn't tell anyone. Who would I have told? Eunice asked, not sharply but firmly. The law doesn't act on what we feel is right. It acts on what can be proven, and at the time, there wasn't enough to challenge ownership. Not cleanly, not successfully. Margaret stared at the papers, but you knew someone would come looking. Eunice held her gaze. I hoped, she said. Silence stretched between them, not empty, but full of something unresolved finally being named. And Whitlock? Margaret asked. Eunice's expression hardened. He acquired the land legally, she said, but he also knew the history was unstable. That's why he moved fast to consolidate everything around it. When ownership is unclear, the first person to establish control usually keeps it. Margaret exhaled slowly. So he didn't create the gap. No, Eunice said. Time did. Neglected. People assuming no one would ever come back to care about it. Margaret felt the shift then. Not a villain hiding everything. Not a single hand pulling strings. Something worse. Something quieter. Something that happened because no one stopped it. What can I do now? She asked. Eunice didn't hesitate. You can finish what was started, she said, but not by claiming the land the way that Record tried to. That path is gone. Margaret nodded slowly. Then how? Eunice reached for a folder on her desk. By proving historical significance, she said. By showing that what Cordelia built here through the schoolhouse, the journals, the letters, has measurable cultural impact. Enough to qualify for preservation status. Margaret looked at her. You mean protect it without owning it? I mean protect it so no one can erase it, Eunice said. The distinction mattered, more than Margaret expected. Over the next weeks, Margaret didn't stop. She brought the journals, the letters, the ledger that documented years of quiet giving. Jasper added his own records, family accounts passed down, names that matched entries in Cordelia's books. Mr. Gormley gave testimony about the schoolhouse's role in the community decades ago. Lavinia Bryson confirmed stories that had never been written down but never forgotten either. And then Joseph Bellamy arrived. He walked into the schoolhouse one morning, older now, steady, carrying the kind of presence that came from years of responsibility. He didn't say much at first, just stood in the doorway, looking around. She wrote to me, he said finally, years ago, when I was trying to finish medical school and didn't think I could. Margaret didn't interrupt. I never met her, he continued. But she knew someone who knew someone who knew me. That's how it worked. She made sure help reached the right person without ever needing credit. He looked at Margaret. You're part of that chain, he said. The words landed differently this time, not as a theory, as something proven. With every statement, every document, every connection verified, the case built, not for ownership, but for recognition. And recognition, Eunice reminded her, had power. The hearing wasn't dramatic, no raised voices. No sudden confessions, just evidence. Layered, verified, consistent. The journals matched the letters matched the ledger matched testimonies. Independent records confirmed timelines, names lined up across decades. It took time, but it held, and in the end the designation came through. The schoolhouse and the surrounding tract were granted protected historical status, tied directly to Cordelia Ashby's documented impact and the sustained community legacy that followed. Whitlock didn't fight it, not publicly. He withdrew his development plans within weeks, sold off adjacent parcels, and disappeared from the conversation as quietly as he had entered it. Margaret never saw him again. The day the official notice arrived, she stood in the schoolhouse alone for a long time. The same room, the same worn floorboards, the same hearth that had once hidden something she thought would save her. She realized then it had, just not in the way she expected. The foundation came next, not large, not flashy, but real, structured through Eunice, supported by initial contributions from people like Jasper and, unexpectedly, Joseph, who insisted on funding the first restoration phase. They named it simply, the Ashby Foundation. Its purpose was clear: continue the chain, quiet support, direct impact. No recognition required. Letters were sent, carefully, to people identified through the records, those who had been part of the chain knowingly or not, and some responded, some visited, some just wrote back, but the circle began to close. Months later, the schoolhouse filled again, not with noise, not with crowds, but with presence. Former students, people who had been helped, people who had helped others because of it. They stood in the same room, older now, carrying lives that traced back to something that had started here. Margaret stood at the front, not as an owner, not as a beneficiary, but as a keeper. She looked out at them, at the faces, the quiet gratitude, the stories that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. And for the first time since that courthouse parking lot, she didn't feel like something had been taken from her. She felt like she had been placed exactly where she was meant to be. Later, when most had left, she picked up a piece of chalk. The blackboard was still worn, still imperfect. She wrote slowly, not a lesson, just a name, Cordelia Wren Ashby. Then she paused, and beneath it added another. Margaret Calloway, not equal, not the same, but connected. The room held that truth quietly, a legacy that had never needed to be owned to endure, only continued. If you've ever been part of something that changed your life without asking for recognition, take a moment to think about where that chain began and where it might lead next.